Imagine this for a moment. A ruler dies. The palace goes quiet. The candles still burn beside the bed. And somewhere in the corridors, a woman who has spent years being overlooked finally realizes that no one stands above her anymore. In that instant, history changes. Not with a battle trumpet, not with a grand declaration, but with a private decision made in silence. A decision to remember every humiliation, every betrayal, every stolen affection, every threat. And once that memory fuses with absolute power, revenge stops being personal. It becomes political. It becomes ritual. It becomes history, written in blood. Stay with me until the end of this story, because what you are about to hear is not a simple collection of cruel women from the past. It is something more unsettling. These were queens, empresses, and regents who learned the same terrifying lesson in different centuries and different civilizations. Once pain is given a crown, it can command armies, rewrite laws, bury rivals, blind sons, burn cities, and still leave behind monuments, churches, and legends that call the whole thing greatness. And that is what makes these stories dangerous. None of these women were born as monsters. Most began as wives, daughters, hostages, outsiders, consorts, mothers, women dismissed by the men around them. But power has a way of turning long memory into a weapon, and when revenge is patient enough, it becomes almost impossible to stop. In ancient China, one of the darkest scenes in imperial history began in a cellar. A young emperor is led downstairs by his mother. The air is damp. The room is almost black, and in the corner, something is still breathing. It has no hands, no feet, no eyes, no ears, no voice. The emperor stares at it in horror and asks the only question he can ask. "What is that?" His mother answers calmly. "That is Lady Qi." This was Empress Lu, one of the first great political women of the Han world, and Lady Qi had once been her rival for the love of Emperor Gaozu. But rivalry was not enough to explain what happened next. What Lady Qi had really done was threaten the future of Empress Lu's son. She had tried to use beauty, affection, and influence to replace the rightful heir with her own child. And when Gaozu died in 195 BC, Empress Lu no longer had to hide what she felt. She moved with the cold precision of someone who had rehearsed revenge for years. Lady Qi was arrested, mutilated, and thrown into a pit beneath the palace, transformed into what Empress Lu called a human swine. Then, in an act even more psychologically cruel, she made her own son come and look at it. The boy was so shattered by what he saw that he withdrew from power, leaving Empress Lu even freer to rule from behind the throne. Lady Qi's son was poisoned soon after. Ministers who seemed dangerous were removed. Even great founders of the dynasty were not safe if Empress Lu suspected disloyalty. She ruled for years, not just through authority, but through the terror of what she had already proven herself willing to do. That is the first pattern to notice. Revenge becomes most absolute when it is no longer aimed only at the person who caused pain. It spreads to children, allies, witnesses, memory itself. Now cross the world to Madagascar, where another woman turned insecurity into a kingdom-wide purge. Ranavalona was not supposed to become the ruler of anything. She entered the royal world not through destiny, but through accident, marriage, and quiet survival in the shadow of more favored women. She was childless, politically underestimated, and easy to ignore. Until the king died. The moment the throne opened, she struck before anyone understood she had been preparing. Alliances she had built in silence suddenly moved into the open. The legitimate heir was eliminated. Palace positions were seized. By morning, the woman no one had truly feared was queen. And once she wore the crown, she ruled as if the entire island were a potential conspiracy. Relatives of the old king were hunted down. Rivals vanished. Foreign missionaries were expelled. Christianity was forbidden. Suspicion became policy. Innocence meant nothing if accusation had already been spoken. Under her reign, ordeal by poison became a mechanism of mass fear. Thousands were forced to swallow poison to prove their innocence. Many never survived the test. Others were burned, enslaved, worked to death, thrown from heights, or consumed by the machinery of projects that seemed to value monuments more than human life. What makes Ranavalona so difficult to simplify is that she was not only destructive, she also preserved Madagascar's independence in an age when foreign powers were swallowing nations whole. And that is why her memory remains divided. To some, she was a shield. To others, a catastrophe. But perhaps the more frightening truth is that she was both. A protector to the state and a destroyer to her people. Then came Irene of Athens, whose revenge was aimed not at a rival woman, not at a foreign power, but at her own son. She entered the Byzantine court as an unlikely bride, a girl of no extraordinary rank, then became regent when her husband died and her son, Constantine VI, was still a child. At first, she ruled capably. The empire functioned, councils met, policy moved. But the problem with borrowed power is that one day the child grows up. As Constantine became a man, he wanted the throne in fact, not only in name. He forced his mother aside. For a lesser person, that might have been the end. For Irene, it was simply the interval before retaliation. She waited. She watched him lose support. She let his mistakes ripen in public. And when enough people were disappointed in him, she returned with the precision of someone who had never emotionally accepted defeat. In 797, he was captured and taken to the very chamber where she had once given birth to him. There, by her order, his eyes were put out. In Byzantium, that was more than mutilation. It was political annihilation. A blind emperor could not rule. And he did not recover. Imagine the symbolism of that moment. A mother bringing her son back to the room of his birth to end his future with her own command. She did not merely retake the throne. She declared that what she had given life to, she had the right to destroy. If you have ever seen a real-life situation where someone stayed outwardly patient for a long time and then, once power shifted, repaid every insult all at once, leave a comment with your example. It does not have to be royal or dramatic. Sometimes the psychology of history appears first in offices, families, friendships, or business deals, in smaller rooms with the same human instincts. Now back to China, where Wu Zetian rose from the margins of the palace to a height no woman had reached before or since. She entered the court at 14 as one more young attendant among many. But even then, there was something different about her. Not simply beauty, vision. She watched. She learned. She understood where real power sat and how often it hid behind ceremony. When the emperor died, she should have disappeared into a convent and vanished from history. Instead, she found her way back into the palace through the next ruler, broke convention, won favor, and began climbing. Then came the death that changed everything. Her infant daughter died, and Wu blamed the empress. Whether the accusation was true, or whether it was one of the coldest calculations in imperial history, no one can say for certain. But what followed is clear. The empress fell, Wu rose, and once she reached the center, she did not stop at influence. She wanted the throne itself. Enemies were denounced, imprisoned, mutilated, killed. Former rivals were beaten, dismembered, and left to die in vats of wine. Her own sons were raised to the throne and pushed aside when useful. Informants multiplied. Fear spread through the court like smoke, and yet, in the middle of all this brutality, she governed with startling competence. Reforms expanded opportunity. Agriculture strengthened. The empire remained stable. That contradiction is exactly why she endures. She was both terrifying and effective, which is often the most dangerous kind of ruler of all. When she finally declared herself emperor, not empress, emperor, she crossed a line no one had crossed before. And even her tomb was left with a wordless stele, as if no inscription could safely contain her. Then there was Olga of Kiev, whose revenge unfolded like a four-part ritual. Her husband Igor was not merely killed by the Drevlians. He was executed in a way designed to humiliate him and send a message to everyone who watched. Then, astonishingly, the same people who murdered him proposed marriage to his widow, as if political convenience could erase blood. Olga answered with courtesy. And that was the first trap. Envoys arrived, expecting honor, and were buried alive. A second delegation arrived, expecting ceremony, and was burned in a bathhouse. Then came a funeral feast turned massacre, where drunken guests were cut down in their thousands. And finally, a besieged city accepted what seemed like a harmless demand for tribute in birds, only to watch those same birds return home, carrying fire to their roofs. And what makes Olga unforgettable is not just the brutality of her revenge, but the precision behind it. She did not act in rage. She acted in stages. Each move calculated, each step disguised as tradition, diplomacy, or mourning. By the time her enemies understood what was happening, it was already too late. That is the deeper danger of power fueled by memory. It becomes patient. It learns to wait. But here is where her story becomes even more unsettling. After all of this, after burying envoys alive, burning men in a bathhouse, massacring thousands at a feast, and destroying a city from within, Olga did something no one expects. She became a wise and effective ruler. She reformed the system of tribute, stabilized governance, strengthened her lands, and even embraced Christianity, later being remembered as a saint. That contradiction is not a mistake. It is a warning. History does not divide people into monsters and heroes as cleanly as we would like. Sometimes the same person can embody both. And that is exactly what makes power so dangerous. It allows people to justify anything, as long as the outcome can later be framed as necessary. Then comes another kind of ruler, not one who openly takes the throne, but one who understands that real control often hides behind it. Empress Dowager Cixi never declared herself emperor. She didn't need to. She ruled through children, through access, through silence, through timing. When she entered the imperial court, she was just one among many. No one expected her to dominate an empire. But she watched. She learned. She understood something fundamental. Power is not about titles. It is about who controls decisions. When her son became emperor as a child, she stepped into that invisible space behind the throne. Ministers believed they could govern. They were wrong. One by one, obstacles disappeared. Alliances shifted. Authority concentrated. And suddenly, the empire spoke with one voice, even if that voice never officially carried her name. But the most revealing moment of her rule came when change threatened her position. The Guangxu emperor, no longer a child, began to push for reform. Education, modernization, transformation. A chance to shift China's future. Cixi saw something deeper. Reform meant independence. Independence meant losing control. So she acted. The emperor was isolated. The reforms were crushed. The palace became both center of power and place of confinement. And then came the moment that history still whispers about. The emperor died just one day before her. Years later, poison was found in his remains. No confession, no written order, just timing, motive, and silence. And sometimes, silence tells the clearest story. Now step into Europe, into a different kind of battlefield. Not one defined by a single rival, but by an entire nation splitting apart. Catherine de' Medici did not begin as a powerful queen. She began as an outsider, foreign, underestimated, surrounded by people who saw her as temporary. Her husband ignored her. The court dismissed her. For years, she survived rather than ruled. But time changed everything. Her husband died. Her sons inherited the throne, one after another, too young to rule. And suddenly, Catherine stood at the center of a fragile kingdom, tearing itself apart between Catholics and Protestants. This was not a simple struggle for power. It was a war of belief. A war where every side was convinced it was right, and every compromise looked like betrayal. Catherine tried to balance it, to negotiate, to survive between forces that trusted no one. But balance cannot hold forever when fear grows stronger than reason. Then came the massacre. What began as a moment meant to unify turned into one of the darkest nights in French history. Bells rang, doors were broken, names were called, and the streets filled with blood. Thousands died, not in battle, but in coordinated violence that spread beyond control. Whether Catherine intended the scale or lost control of it, one thing is certain: the line had been crossed. And once crossed, it cannot be undone. Now step back and look at all these stories together. Different continents, different centuries, different cultures, and yet the same pattern repeats. A woman underestimated, a moment of vulnerability, a memory of humiliation, access to power, and then a transformation. Revenge stops being emotional and becomes structural. It enters systems. It shapes decisions. It rewrites reality around itself. This is the point most people miss. These women were not dangerous only because of what they did. They were dangerous because they understood when to act. They knew when others were weak. They knew when fear was highest. They knew when no one would dare to stop them. And most importantly, they understood that once power is absolute, consequences become optional. But here is the part that matters most. None of these stories begin with violence. They begin with dismissal. With someone being ignored, underestimated, pushed aside, humiliated, replaced, or threatened. The violence comes later. The transformation comes after. So the real question is not why they became ruthless. The real question is how many moments along the way could have changed everything. Because history is not only shaped by those who take revenge, it is shaped by those who assume it will never happen. And that is the final warning. Power does not always corrupt instantly. Sometimes it waits. It studies. It remembers. And when the moment finally comes, it does not hesitate. Because in the end, the most dangerous revenge is not the loudest one. It is the one that has been waiting the longest.